Great, thank you. So a couple of important clarifications. First of all, the paper, as it stands now, tells just half of the story of how the National Assembly building came to be, and that is the side of the Romanian-designed team. It is my hope that there will be a follow-up that will present the Sudanese side as well, either by way of accessing local archives or conducting interviews with the people involved. And the second clarification is that this research has been initially presented in the conference, The Gift of Architecture, Spaces of Global Socialism and Their Afterlives in June 2022 in Manchester, where I was invited by Professor Lukáš Stanek. And finally, some acknowledgements are in place. I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Dr. Irina Tulbure, who graciously assisted me with archival research, and to Dr. Cezar Popescu for their support in carrying out this research while being unable to travel. This research was happening during COVID times. I will go briefly over the political and economic context for the Sudan and Romania diplomatic relations in the beginning. This section of the paper will briefly cover the political context in Sudan that led to the need for a seat of the parliament to be built, and to the design being a collaboration with Romanian specialists. In a following section, we will discuss the public discourse on this project and the diplomatic realities behind it, and reclassify the term collaboration. Following the Egyptian Revolution of 1952, Sudan pursued its independence from the Anglo-Egyptian leadership. In 1956, following a polling process, a democratic parliament was created, and Ismail al-Zahari was elected prime minister of the newly independent Sudan. On 25 May 1969, Colonel Jafar Nimeiry led a coup d'etat and became prime minister. In turn, there was a coup in July 1971, led by the then outlawed Sudanese Communist Party, that briefly removed Nimeiry from power. He was, however, assisted by non-Marxist military to regain power, and the bloody repression against the communists ensued. Hence, both the Soviet Union and some of its East European allies were accused of supporting the Sudanese communists in carrying out the coup, and reactions to this situation were all over the press at the time. Obviously, the Soviet Union reacted, and also Ceaușescu and the Romanian Communist Party Central Committee also issued a declaration in support of the Sudanese communists and against the repression. However, Ceaușescu's position must be read as support for the Sudanese communists and not as agreeing with the Soviet position, given his disobedient public position that became a staple for him after the Warsaw Pact countries invaded Czechoslovakia in 1968. His discourse on independence and the principle of non-intervention in internal affairs became more and more prominent after 1968, directly referring to the Soviet invasion. However, the singular position is not surprising for those who followed the external affairs of Romania. Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej, Ceaușescu's predecessor, was a vocal opponent of the Soviet supported economic principle of international division of labor, the application of which would have condemned Romania to a permanent state of lack of industrialization, an agricultural country status. In fact, during Gheorghiu-Dej and then Ceaușescu, the industrialization of Romania was relentlessly pursued, together with an economic opening towards Western Europe and the United States. Romania was able to increase its exports to both Western and Eastern markets. With some able maneuvers by the 1970s, Romania was the only Warsaw Pact country to have a generalized trade agreement with the European Economic Community. There was the added bonus of having access to Western technology, which was furthermore enhanced by its anti-Soviet stance in Romania's foreign policy. This self-driven, headstrong industrialization required substantial amounts of resources, especially raw materials. When the imports of oil and gas from the Soviet Union became too expensive or altogether unavailable, Ceaușescu started looking for alternative sources of import, especially in Africa. The Romanian maverick foreign policy that Ceaușescu was pursuing in the late 1960s was in part meant to find resources and export markets for Romanian products, but it also illustrated the claims at autonomy within the Eastern Bloc and assisted in propelling him to the status of an internationally relevant political leader. To this end, Ceaușescu took numerous diplomatic visits. Between 1972 and 80, he visited Africa 6 times. He was also welcome in many Western countries. the UK among them, where he was received by the late Queen in 1978 in an episode regarded as a low point in British diplomacy, but as stellar in Romania. Without being especially charismatic in his diplomatic relations, Ceaușescu was cunning. One particular moment in successfully establishing the relations with the African countries was in 1972, when he declared Romania as a developing country as well, albeit a socialist one. Together with the discourse centered on the principles of sovereignty and non-interference in domestic affairs, Ceaușescu spun a narrative where Romania had brotherly, mutually beneficial relations with the African countries and saw himself as a leader of the developing world. Technological exports and expertise were on offer. As part of the commercial agreement first signed between Romania and Sudan in 1972, a cotton mill, mining equipment, chemical industrial machinery, timber processing machinery, technical assistance for agriculture were some of the main items that the Romanians were going to export in exchange for cotton, rawhide, and gum arabic. However, the development of the diplomatic and economic relations between the two countries was by no means linear, and the project for the Khartoum National Assembly has its own particular place outside the signed agreement. Diplomatic relations with Sudan. Romania entered such diplomatic relations with Sudan in January 1956, when Romania recognized Sudan's independence straight away. However, a critical point was reached in August 1969, when Sudan broke off diplomatic relations with Romania as a result of Romania and Israel promoting their respective diplomatic locations to embassy level. Romania denounced Sudan's unilateral act as an interference in Romania's internal affairs. Within this diplomatic climate, it is quite surprising that Ceaușescu added Sudan to the list of African states he visited in 1972 with the purpose of establishing economic agreements. However, by the end of the visit, the two presidents noted that the past differences had been resolved and several agreements were signed: an agreement on economic and technical cooperation, a long-term trade agreement, and the protocol on trade exchanges. Ceaușescu pushed for establishing mixed joint ventures on geological prospecting, mining, industry, agriculture, and forestry. And Michael Radu, a researcher of the time, noted that the main reason why such anti-communist states as Zaire, Gabon, and Sudan were willing to sign formal treaties with Romania is their attempt to maintain some channels of communication to the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe open, and an economic interest manifest in their acceptance of Romanian loans, investments, and joint economic ventures. It is particularly interesting to go through the list of collaboration items that were meant to be included in the cooperation agreement, just to note the great missing element, the elephant in the room. There is no mention of the National Assembly building. While the Khartoum North fine spinning mill is mentioned, which was provided with Romanian equipment, the National Assembly building is not included in the list, but relegated to a pre-signing note as a personal wish from President Nimeiry. So not much of a gift, but almost a condition for further collaboration. And I quote, "Before signing the Romanian-Sudanese declaration, President Nimeiry expressed to Comrade Nicolae Ceaușescu his personal wish that a group of Romanian architects and builders would draw up the plans and construct the building for the future Sudanese parliament. The President of the Democratic Republic of Sudan underlined that this work is being carried out directly under his auspices and asked that the Romanian specialists arrive in Khartoum as soon as possible, given the urgency of the reconstruction of the building. The Sudanese head of state estimated that parliamentary life would be restored in Sudan within a year at the most." Comrade Nicolae Ceaușescu told his interlocutor that immediately after his return to the country, he would appoint a group of Romanian architects and builders requested by President Nimeiry, and that they would arrive in Khartoum in April the same year. And General Nimeiry had instructed Mehdi Mustafa, Minister of State for Presidential Affairs, to maintain permanent contact with the Romanian Chargé d'Affaires in Sudan in order to perfect the visit of the Romanian architects and builders to Khartoum. On the second visit Ceaușescu took to Sudan in 1979, the presentation of the National Assembly building is brief and framed as a project with Romanian technical assistance, which was inaugurated on 26 December 1978. Interestingly enough, there is mention of the Sudanese representative suggesting that the Romanians should further build a presidential palace in the gardens of the People's Palace. There is also mention of a project being started and on the way to being approved, but then almost out of the blue, the initiative grinds down to a halt and the project is never finalized. Generally, there is no talk of unsuccessful pursuits, so we have no information on what exactly happened, but the second palace was no longer mentioned. As a speculation, it might have to do with the conditions of the loan that the Sudanese were asking for when it came to this kind of building project. We do have a rather detailed account of the results of the negotiations that took place ahead of signing the contract through a series of notes. The negotiations were by no means straightforward. Just one second. Something is happening. Yes. When it comes to the elaboration of the tender project and its approval, this seems to have worked out quite easily. But the amount of the loan that Sudan was asking for to cover the entire cost of the works, and particularly what kind of works were included in the loan, were topics of contention. The Romanians put the project on a very fast track, somewhat at odds with the Sudanese, who didn't seem to be in such a hurry anymore. A protocol was signed in Bucharest on 6th of April 1973, agreeing that the Romanians would construct the National Assembly building in Omdurman under the financial conditions laid out in the Agreement for Economic and Technical Cooperation, 1st of April 1972. The general contractor would be Arcom, with the Carpaths Construction Trust as a subcontractor. The Sudanese side proposed a joint venture between Arcom and the Sudanese Public Corporation for Building and Constructions, an organization that was set up for this purpose. They also proposed that the joint venture should continue its activity once the parliament building was done, building housing in Sudan. I would really like to see if that happened. Representatives of the Ministry for Foreign Trade, Arcom, the Design Institute Carpaths, and the Carpaths Construction Trust visited Sudan in order to get the required information for tender. Later that year, in June, another delegation led by Cezar Lازarيسكو went to Khartoum for the approval of the design solution before starting on the other more detailed stages of the project. And you can see some of the sketches that they presented there. The solution was approved. However, when it comes to the financial side of things, problems arose. Basically, they could not agree on the terms of the loan. It was evaluated that the cost of the building was about $11 million, and the Romanians would have liked to support with 4.7 million, and they wanted the local expenses to be supported by Sudanese, local expenses meaning local materials and workforce. And the amount of that should have been around $5.1 million. However, a while later, a brief conversation between Ceaușescu and Lázărescu points to the fact that the construction works were being paid by the Romanian side for the most part, and that local materials and workforce were a rarity. This shed some light on the fact that the financial aspects of the deal were not particularly advantageous for Romania, and explains why some of the items on the long list of future collaborations never saw the light of day. And now going to Cezar Lázărescu, the architect himself. Putting aside the somewhat soured financial aspects of the project, the Sudan parliament is still the most representative international project designed by Romanian architects abroad. In practice, more used to technical adaptations of projects or smaller scale developments, or even collaborations with other international architects, this Romanian design stands out, not necessarily as by its originality, but as an accomplishment of team of architects and contractors carrying out a complex job miles away from home. It is not surprising that Ceaușescu chose architect Cezar Lázărescu to carry out this project, supervising architects from the Design Institute Carpaths. At the time, he was one of the most prominent Romanian architects, being president of the Union of Architects of Romania. But he was also in a delicate position in his career, as he was a very close advisor of the previous Romanian communist leader, Gheorghe Gheorghiu-Dej. The change of power after Gheorghiu-Dej's death in 1965 was followed by the disavowal of his Stalinist type of regime. Many of his collaborators were removed, and of course, Lázărescu had to tread carefully for a while. But he was a very charismatic person, well-versed in working for high-ranking political characters. Certainly, the fact that he was sent to Khartoum to present the project to President Nimeiry was in part due to his adaptability and charisma when faced with men in power, but it was also due to his qualities as an architect and site manager. At the time, he was riding the second wave of modernism after socialist realism, which he helped usher in through the extensive projects for the Black Sea resorts. He oversaw all of that. One could read the Parliament of Sudan as another challenge that was sent his way, a large-scale project abroad to be designed following a brief put together by the Sudanese with extensive oversight from the president himself. The financial conditions of the loan could have spelled disaster at any moment, plus the diplomatic relations with Sudan had recently been volatile. However, putting aside the cost issues, the project was successfully completed and there was nothing but praise in the media for it. In fact, the mediatic representation of the project is a story in itself. The rhetoric of the Romanian media about the National Assembly was that such a successful project was the result of intense collaboration with the Sudanese partners, that the building was appreciated and appropriated by the Sudanese, especially since it was an expression of their desires rather than an externally imposed vision. Lázărescu proclaimed, "We don't make gifts, we don't do turnkey projects, we collaborate." This is terribly ironic, as in the presentation of the design team, although an exhaustive list of specialists and consultants is offered, as you can see, there is no Sudanese name mentioned, not even the Sudanese Public Corporation for Building Constructions. Lázărescu developed an entire argument to support the architectural expression of the project in case he would have been confronted with criticism regarding the apparent simplicity of the building. He internalized the official discourse of Romania being itself a developing country, better suited to understanding the struggles of Sudan and being able to respond in a more sympathetic way. And a bit of a tone-deaf quote from him. What is important is that in these countries, within a feeling of pride and dignity, there is also the need for the beneficiaries to feel part of what is being built, to feel represented by the buildings they make, in all aspects, even that of design. But again, I come back to the fact that there was no design involvement practically in this project. Knowing the level of friction that the use of local materials and workforce determine the course of the works, Lázărescu's remark is rather bold, and I quote, "The key to Romanian success in these countries is due to the fact that for us collaboration means helping our partners to do what they want and not to do what we think they want. For us, collaboration means helping in the training of their own staff, in the introduction of technologies appropriate to the level of development of their respective country. It means helping our partners develop through their own strengths and ideas. To be more specific, the success of the Sudanese parliament, which is so appreciated by the local population, is largely due to the fact that it is considered to be their own work. Of course, the Romanian support is not contested or questioned, but the reality is that we have supported them in making this house themselves. The company that carried out the work was led by a Sudanese specialist. Oh, how I wish I would meet that person and know if he was real, probably a gentleman. The workmanship was Sudanese, the basic materials were Sudanese, the functionality and architectural expression of the house correspond to Sudanese concepts and sensibilities. This is why they appropriated this building. The fact that and I end quote, the fact that the image of the building made it to the £1 or the 100 dinars banknotes seems to support this narrative of appropriation by the Sudanese on the long run. There might have been some local adaptations of the design, especially with regards to preventing solar gain with volumetric shading elements or applying some Masharabia-inspired screens to the facades. But for the most part, the project is just a reinterpretation of various themes employed in projects for cultural centers, Casa de Cultura, or administrative centers and city halls, quite refined by their use in multiple projects across Romania. A whole architectural language was developed around the use of prefabricated facade elements that simplified the construction but were also used as means of expression. There is even a name for it, lyrical functionalism, which situates it stylistically somewhere between functionalist and brutalist architecture with some expressive explorations into the vernacular. One can look at the Târgoviște, Suceava, or Baia Mare cultural centers to see the affiliation. Hence, originality is not the attribute to describe the National Assembly. With the apparent divide between the reality of the project and the collaboration narrative constructed around it, it is not surprising that not too much was written about the Sudan parliament in the Romanian media, not even the professional one. There is an interview with Cezar Lازarيسكو and the usual project presentation in the Arhitectura magazine, and only a couple of fleeting mentions in the national daily Scânteia. Then it all went quiet, and nowadays you would be hard-pressed to find a Romanian architect who knows it, although they could probably still cite other of Lázărescu's works. At the inauguration in 1978, there was a Romanian delegation from the Great National Assembly. Ceaușescu visited it in 1979. Then in August 1982, President Nimeiry took one last visit to Bucharest to renew the friendship and collaboration agreements. But then in April 1985, he was deposed as a result of another coup. Ceaușescu himself was to follow and have a much grimmer fate in December 1989. So the conclusions. The project of the National Assembly is not an example of architectural gift-giving. It was not offered, but rather requested as a sign of commitment when entering into economic relations with Sudan. Neither the project nor the construction were gifted. The Romanians were scrupulously putting on record all the expenses, while also disputing the types of expenses that were reasonably covered by the loan. The fact that the loan was never repaid in full makes it somewhat an inadvertent gift, but not an intentional one. The narrative was quite opposed to the idea of gift-giving and emphasizing brotherly cooperation and empowerment. The reality was that the project was a vessel to carry Ceaușescu's ego, and in some part that of Lázărescu as well, on a journey of self-aggrandizing his role as a leader of the developing countries and mediator in the Middle East conflicts. I see it now as being quite relevant for the future megalomaniacal intervention of Ceaușescu in the core of Bucharest to build the Palace of the People, a project for which Lázărescu fought nail and teeth and lost. The Parliament of Sudan helped cement Lázărescu's position at the side of the president. The fact that this undertaking remained singular, not only in the diplomatic and economic relations between Romania and Sudan, but throughout the Romanian architect's experiences abroad, is relevant. The convoluted status of the project and the immediate cost to the Romanian side made it so that this type of gift-giving was unsustainable for the Romanian economy, and the practice swiftly stopped. Its value as a diplomatic lubricant was achieved, but the rhetoric of collaboration and empowerment partially contradicted the aim of propelling Ceaușescu to the status of regional leader. Thank you. Looking forward to questions.